but I'll say it once more for good measure. Flutter uses Dart as the programming language to create apps. Now, if you're familiar with other languages like JavaScript, for example, you'll have no problem picking up Dart. It's going to use a lot of the same concepts, but the syntax is slightly different. So, I'm assuming that by now you're already familiar with the basic concepts and building blocks of another programming language like JavaScript or Python or something else. If you have absolutely no experience with any other programming language, then you probably won't follow along as well with this course, because I'm not going to be going into too much detail about Dart and programming concepts in general. I'm just going to be showing you the things we'll most commonly be using in Flutter so that you're a little familiar with them when we begin. So in this lesson, I just want to give you a quick primer to the language, nothing too deep, and then we're going to pick up all of the rest as we go along. So to do this, I want you to head over to Dartpad, which you can find at dartpad.dartlang.org. Now when you get there, you're going to see something like this, and this is basically a playground for us to test out some Dart code. So on the left we can write our code, and we can see this dummy code waiting for us already. And on the right we have the console, which is where we're going to print out some results. So if I press run now, it's going to run this code, and you're going to see this stuff right here where it's printing stuff out in the console. So let me run that, and we can see hello 5 times. So let me first get rid of all this junk over here. I'm going to keep this function right here, void main, because it expects this function right here. This is what it's called when we click on run. And if I now just print something like hello and put a semicolon at the end, then run it, then we can see hopefully just hello once. Okay, so this is the code which is going to run when we click on the run over here. So I'm going to now delete that thing right there, and the first thing I want to talk about is variables. So Dart uses variables much like any other programming language would use variables. We can store values inside variables, and then we can use those values at a later point in time. Now Dart is also what's known as a statically typed programming language, and what that basically means is that once we declare a variable and we give that variable a type, for example a string, we then can't change the type of that variable in the future. So if I was to create a string variable called name and set that value equal to Sean, then I then can't change the value of that variable to something like 30, an integer, in the future. We can't do that in Dart because it's a statically typed programming language. So let's do a few different examples of variables. The first one I'm going to do is going to be an integer. Now the way we do this to create a variable is by first declaring the type, which is going to be int in my case. Then the variable name, which I'm going to call age, and then we set that equal to a value. And we finish off a statement in Dart with a semicolon, much like in JavaScript. So now we have this age, which is an integer, and it's equal to 30. If we wanted to see it in the console, we just use the print function, and then we'd say what we want to print, which is age. So now if I run this, then hopefully we should see that age over here in the console, which we do. Cool. So let's do another example. I'm going to say this time string. So I'm declaring a string variable now, and saying the name is equal to Chun Lee. And now I'm going to output the name like so. If I press run, then we should see that name. Now what happens when we try to change the type of this. So like I said, we've declared the string and we can't change that now. If I, under here, try to say name is now equal to 30, then this is not going to work because we're trying to change the type of this. And we get an error. It says a value of type int can't be assigned to a variable of type string. So we can't do this. But what we can do is overwrite this value with a different string. So I could say now that this is Ken instead. And if I run this, then it's going to work and it's going to output Ken instead of Chun-Li. Now another type of variable we can do is a boolean, and we do that by saying bool, and we'll give this some kind of variable name like is night, and I'm going to set this equal to false because it's not night where I am at the minute. And then if we try to print this, I'm going to say is night like so, and run this, then we should see hopefully false. There we go. So we've seen these different types of variables inside Dart, but Dart also comes with a different data type called dynamic. And this dynamic type emulates the behavior of a variable in a dynamic language, for example JavaScript. So if we say the type is dynamic, it means we can change that type in the future. Now that does negate the benefit of using a statically typed language, and it may lead to more errors in your code later on if you accidentally switch types. So I'm going to be avoiding using the dynamic variables where possible, and instead you're going to see me more often than not declare the type of variable first. But I will give you a quick example right now. So I'm going to say dynamic and then say like name is equal to Chun-Li, and I'm going to print this first of all. I'm going to say print name and then run it, and hopefully we should see Chun-Li. But then if I try to say name is now equal to 30, which is an integer, and I try to run this, then it is going to allow me to do that. It's going to allow me to change this because it's a dynamic type. But like I said, that negates the benefits of a statically typed language, and you won't see me do this very often, only when I need to do it. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to talk about is functions. And again, Dart also uses functions much like any other programming language would use functions in theirs. And we can see an example of a function right here where it says void main and then the curly braces. So this main function, this is a top level required function in Dart. It's the function that Dart will automatically find and execute when we run a Dart file. And you're going to see this later on in Flutter as well. Now we have the function name here, which is main. Then we have the parentheses and then the curly braces, and any code that you want to execute when this function runs goes inside this code block inside the parentheses. So, I could print, something right here, and obviously because Dart is going to look for this main function and run it when it starts, it's going to run the code inside that, print something. Now we also see this keyword at the start called void, and you'll see this quite often in Dart or another type in front of functions when they're declared. And it basically says what the function is expected to return. Now a function with this void keyword in front of it means that it's not going to return anything. And if we try to return something here, like return a string called hello, then it's going to probably error. So if I try to run this now, you see here the return type string isn't a void as defined by the method main. So we're saying here we don't want this function to return anything. So if I try to return something, it's going to error and not let me do that. but we can return values from functions. We just have to declare what we're returning from the function when we write it. So for example, I could say we're going to return a string from this function, and this function is going to be called greeting. So we'll give it a name of greeting, and inside the curly braces what I'm going to do is just return a string which is hello. Okay, so what I could do now is I could say, okay, I'm going to create a variable up here. Now this variable is going to be a string, and I'm going to call it greet, and I'm going to set it equal to greeting like so. So when we run this function, it's returning this value, which is a string, and we're storing that in this variable. Now this has to match up with what this is, because it's expecting us to return a string. So we couldn't say int right here, because we're not storing an integer, we're storing a string, and it's going to error if we try to do that. So this has to match up with whatever we are actually returning from the function. My goodness, I can't write string properly. Alright, there we go. String greet equals greeting, and we get a string back. I'm going to do the same thing but with an integer. I'm going to call this, I don't know, get age, and then inside the function I'm just going to return 30, like so. And then I could say int age is equal to get age, like so. And I'm also going to print these two things. I'm going to print out the age, and I'm also going to print out greet. So let me save this. Hopefully we should see both of these things over here now. There we go. We get something first of all because we print it right here. Then we get 30, then hello. So this all works. And this is how we return different types inside functions. And remember, when we say void, it means we're not returning anything inside that function. Now, Dart also supports the use of arrow functions, similar to how JavaScript uses arrow functions. And basically we can use these if the return fits onto one line. So as long as we've not got a load of different logic right here, and by the way, this is how we do a comment in Dart, double dash. As long as we don't have a load of logic and then we return something, if we're just returning on one line, then we can convert this to an arrow function. So what we can do is get rid of the curly braces, first of all, right here. Then we can get rid of return, we don't need that. Bring this up to the next line, and then just do an arrow after this, and this is doing exactly the same thing. So we have the function name with the parentheses, an arrow, and then what we return from this function. So if I was to run this now, then everything should still work the same way. I'll do the same with get age. So let me delete the parentheses, the curly braces rather, and the return statement, and pop an arrow right there. And if we run this, it should work exactly the same. There we go. Okay, so this is just a nice way to create functions if they're just returning a single value. And that, my friends, is the basics of functions in Dart. Now, I'd like to also show you a different type in Dart, and that type is called a list. So a list in Dart is a bit like an array in JavaScript. We use the same square bracket notation to store a list of different values. So I'm going to create a list called names. Now we declare the type of this variable first of all. So the type is list, and then the variable name, which is going to be called names, and we set it equal to a list. Now I said we use the same square bracket notation, which we are doing right here, and then we can just place different values inside this list. So I'm going to say Chun-Li, and then I'll do Yoshi, and then I'll do Mario. So I can now underneath print these names by saying print and then names, and I'm going to run this over here, and hopefully we'll see these names in the console, which we can. Okay, so I spelled this completely wrong. It's not Mario, it's Mirion for some reason, so Mario. And what we could do is now add to this list and also remove items from this list by using a couple of different methods. And remember, methods are just functions. So I could say now names.add to add something to this list. So the thing I'm going to add is going to be a new name, Luigi. And then again, we're printing the names down here. So we declare names originally, and we need to update that to be names, not name. Then we add a new name to it, and then we're printing the names. So if we run this now, we should see this with Luigi added as well, which we do. Now we can also remove them by using the remove method. So I'm going to say names dot remove, and then I'll remove Yoshi like so, oops, in quotations, so Yoshi, and we'll run this, and now we see this list without Yoshi, but it still has Luigi in because we added that. Now at the minute we could add in any data type to this list because we've not said what kind of data is going inside this list. We've just said that this is a list. So if I wanted to, I could say names.add, and then I could add an integer, for example 30. And if I run this, it's not going to error, it's going to let me do this. But this is not typically good practice to mix our different data types inside a list. So it's common practice and good practice to put what type of data you expect to be inside this list after we say that it's a list. And the way we do this is by using angle brackets. So we do our angle brackets like that, and then we put in here the type that we expect the data to be inside this list. So I could say string like so, and now it will only let us add strings to this list, and if it finds an integer in it, it's going to error. We can see right here the argument type int can't be assigned to the parameter type string, so it's not letting me do this now. Likewise, if I try to add it up here 30, it's not going to let me do that either, because now we're just expecting a list of strings. If I change this to int, then it's just going to be a list of integers, and now we can't add the strings. So that's good practice to say what type of data are going to be inside these lists. And we're going to be using lists quite frequently as we go forward, especially when we're creating real Flutter apps to store local data in. So we will see them quite a lot as we go forward. So the final thing I'd like to talk about in this primer is classes in Dart. So let me just get rid of all of this junk first of all. So then, classes in pretty much any programming language are like a blueprint for an object. So that object could be something like a user object, and we could store information about that user on that user object, like a username, a biography, an age, etc. Or it could be something like a shopping cart object with information about what's in the shopping cart, like the items, the total number of items, the price of the items, etc. So we have this idea of a class, which is like a blueprint for objects. And we use classes to describe these objects by giving them properties and methods. And methods are just functions. So let's start by creating a simple class. And I'm going to call this class user. So the way we create a class is by using the class keyword first of all. Then I'm going to say user. Convention is that we use an uppercase first letter. And then inside our curly braces, we're going to define the different properties and methods of this user. So I'm going to create two properties. I'm going to say a username and an age. Now the username is going to be a string. So username is going to be equal to Mario, we'll say. And then we'll also do an integer, which is the age, and set that equal to 25. Okay. So we have these two properties defined on this user class now, which is describing a user object. So under here, what we can also do is create a method or a function associated with user objects. So I'm going to create a function. It doesn't return anything, so it will be a void function, and it's called login. And inside here, all we're going to do is print out something like user logged in, like so. Okay then, so we have this user class right here, and it describes our user object. It says it's got two properties and also this method, this login function. Now this is not actually creating any kind of user object in itself. This is just the class, the blueprint, the thing that describes user objects. To actually create a user object based on this class, we'd say user like so and invoke it like we would a function. And that actually creates a user object. We call this instantiating a class or making an instance of this class. So what we can do is then store this in some kind of variable. Now when we made variables in the past, we declared the type first of all, so it said something like string name equal to something, but now the type is going to be a user. This is the type of data we want to store, so we have to say user, and then we'll say user1, which is going to be the variable name, is equal to a user. That is going to create a new instance of this class, a new object, and store it inside this user variable. So now I could do something like print, and then we'll say user1, and we'll get the name, and we'll run this, and hopefully we should see we need the username, not name. Okay, my error. We'll run that again, and hopefully we should see Mario. We do. Let's change this to the age, and we should see 25 over here now, and we don't. Yes, we do now. Okay, and also we could say user1.login and invoke that function, because we have this function defined on this class. So now we have it on this instance of the class as well. So if I run this, then we should see this logged, or rather printed to the console. User logged in. Okay, cool. Now at the minute, if we were to create a new user, so if I say user and then user2, so we're just creating a new user variable and instantiating this class again to create a new object. Now we have two user objects, user1 and user2. But if I do something like this, print and user2.username, then it's going to be Mario, the same as user1.username. So let me change this back to username. These are both going to be the same thing, Mario and Mario. So every user that we create right here is going to have the username Mario and the age of 25, and that's because we hard coded them inside the class. We're saying here that every user is going to have this name and this age. But we can override this behavior. We can use what's known as a constructor inside a class. And a constructor is a special function that runs when we instantiate a class. And that function can take in different parameters so we can override these values. So what I'll do is remove these values from here, and we're still creating these variables, but we're not assigning them any values yet. And then I'm going to create this special function called a constructor, and this constructor has to have the same name as the class itself. So it's going to be called user. And we don't need to put void in front of it or anything like that. This is a special constructor function. And inside here, what we can do is take in some different parameters. So we want to take in two parameters, a username and an age, so that when we create a user like this, we can pass those arguments in and take them in right here. So to take in these parameters, we need to define them. We'll say string and then username. So that's the first parameter we're going to take in, a string called username. And then the second one we're going to take in is going to be an int called age. Now these don't need to be called the same thing. We can call them U and A if you wanted to, and just calling them the same so it's clear what each one is. So now we're saying when we instantiate a class like this, when we create a new user object, we expect these two values, a username and an age, to be passed in as arguments to this thing right here. So we need to pass those in now. So I'm going to say that user1 is now going to be Luigi. That's the name. That's the first argument we pass in. Remember, it has to be a string, the username, and the second one has to be an integer, the age. So I'm going to say that Luigi is 25. So we're passing these in now. The constructor takes them to set up this user object, and now we can set the values of these to equal whatever we passed in. So I can say now this.username, and that refers to this instance that we've created. So whatever object we create, and it's going to grab the username of that object, and it's going to set it equal to this thing right here, username, like so. So we're taking that value that we bring in and we're assigning it to the username property of this instance. And we're going to do the same thing for the age. So this.age is equal to the age that we bring in. So now, when we create a user, they're all going to be unique because we can pass in unique names and ages. So user 2 now could be something like Mario, and Mario is going to be 30. So now when we print out these usernames, then they should be different. So we should have Luigi and Mario, and they have different ages as well. Okay, so that's a basic class with some properties, a constructor, and also a method, a function. Now we can also do this thing in Dart called inheritance. And inheritance is basically when we have a class that inherits from another class. So say we have this type of user called a super user, and we want it to inherit these properties and this function. It has all the same properties and behavior as a regular user, but we also want it to have an extra function to publish updates or something like that. We don't want normal users to have that publish update function, so we don't want to define that function here, but we want it on the super user. So what we can do is say, okay, well, we'll create a new class called super user, and that is going to extend from this class right here. That means inherit from it. So it inherits all this behavior, but then we could add additional behavior and properties to that class as well. So let me come down here, and this time I'll say class super user, and we say extends, and it's going to be the user class that we extend from. So now the first thing we want to do is create that extra function. So this is going to be a void function, and it's going to be called publish. So let's create that, and inside we'll just print, and we'll just say published update. So a simple function, but only super users should have this thing right here. Now we're getting an error at the minute right here, and it says the superclass user doesn't have a zero argument constructor. So it's saying, okay, well, if I was to create a new super user which extends user, that's fine, but you've not actually said which username and age you want to apply to this super user. We have a constructor here, but we don't here. So let's create that. We'll say super user, and we'll take in the string, which is a username again, and we'll also take in the int, which is the age. But that's not enough. Now what we need to do is a colon, and then say super, and pass in the username that we get, which is this thing, and also the age. Okay? So what is going on here? Well, we're creating a constructor for the super user, so that when we create a new super user up here, much like we have done here, we pass in the values, username and age. Then we don't set those values right here in the super user. We inherit from the user which has those values. So what we need to do is call super, which calls this constructor right here in the class it extends from, so this thing, and it passes those values in. So it sets those values right here as well. So now we inherit the values, we also inherit the function automatically, but we also have this extra function for super users. So let me go to the top. I'm going to create a new super user this time, and I'm going to call this user 3 and set it equal to a new super user, and I'm going to pass in Yoshi as the username and also 20 as the age. Now then, down here I could say print, and I'm going to say user 3.name, or rather username, and then I'm also going to say user 3, and I'm going to use that publish method down here. Where is it? This thing right here, because we have that now on this kind of super user. So I'll say publish, like so. So if I run this, it should all work. We should see Luigi, Mario, Yoshi, and then published update. Now if I try to say something like user2.publish, I'm not going to be able to do this because it doesn't have access to that published function. We can see that error. But user3 does have access to it because it's a super user. And also user3 also has access to the login function because we extended the user class right here and we inherited that login function. So if I delete this and run, then this should work as well. Published update. Awesome. So that pretty much explains the basics of classes and how to extend classes. Again, if all of this was too much and it went too quickly, probably I would advise you to learn more about programming in general and learn about classes and things like that before you come back here and try this tutorial series. But if that was kind of okay, then you're in a good position to carry on. Don't worry if you didn't follow it all step for step. If you understood the bulk of it, that's good enough. And that pretty much covers the introduction to Dart. Again, I just wanted this to be a primer, an overview of some of the more common language constructs that we're going to see inside Flutter quite frequently. So we can jump straight into Flutter and start creating apps. And with these basics under your belt, you're going to have no problem picking up the rest as we go on. Things like list methods or string methods or more about classes. And if you do want to read more about a particular method or data type or something else about that, you can always check out the docs. Just go to dartlang.org and you're going to see all the docs for the Dart language right here. So you can go to docs and anything you want to learn you can search for, or you can go through the different examples they have on their website as well. So hopefully now you're going to be in a good position to jump into Flutter in the next video and start to learn how to create mobile apps with it.